Seahawks had some more roster news. Tyrel Dodson, who has started all 9 games this season, is going to be released by the Seahawks today. That's from Brady Henderson of ESPN.com, who had that tweet. You can follow him at Brady Henderson on Twitter. Tyrel Dodson out. Jerome Baker out. Ernest Jones in. The Seahawks rebuilding their linebacker core on the fly, and it does look like, Mike, that they are going to be giving rookie Tyrese Knight a really long look here in the season's second half, which I think is important. You got to see what you have in a draft pick like that. But also, maybe what does it say about this offseason that the Seahawks just had, where the 2 linebackers that you brought in to essentially, kind of say, all right, we're getting younger, we're getting more athletic at the linebacking spot, have not panned out over the course of 9 games.
Well, it's pretty stunning because you'd like to think that those 2 were identified for specific reasons, that they were brought in because they were players that Mike Macdonald thought and John Schneider thought they could fit in well. That Mike Macdonald comes in and he has a defense, wants players who can fit that. We saw that in maybe guys who weren't retained by the Seahawks, maybe we thought they would, or specific players they went and drafted, like a Tyrese Knight. It turns out now probably pretty important, and why Mike Macdonald after the draft talked about what they liked about Tyrese Knight. We were doing that show, Curtis, when they drafted him in the 4th round.
That's right.
And we're like, oh, that's kind of surprising. Well, turns out he's a great run defender. And what's been the issue?
You kind of need
run
that.
defense.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if we talked about what changes to the Seahawks coming out of the bye, and you have that time to do that self-scouting. And if I wonder if you go back and after these coaches had all this time to look at the film, to look at maybe things that weren't happening correctly, if in that translation from things they wanted run, they noticed something about Tyrel Dodson, that it wasn't clicking. It wasn't being communicated. And this was Mike Macdonald, when Ernest Jones was brought in, still mentioning that Tyrel Dodson, he's the green dot. So he was still in charge of the defense. You're going to have to replace that. But this is what Macdonald said about why Dodson was still going to be in charge of the defense.
Right now, T-Dot's probably keep the green dot.
What about Dodson makes him suited for weak side?
Well, he's a guy that's played both in Buffalo, and that was part of the conversation when we signed him, where he would play. And he's got great tape on the weak side too. So I think it's more of a, hey, Ernest has played more Mike. That's kind of where he's been. T-Dot can play. We feel comfortable kind of moving him back and forth. He's gotten a lot of reps at will and dime throughout training camp, and he takes plenty of reps on both sides throughout the week. So it's more of a seamless transition for him than to take Ernest and move him out of a spot. It's really what drove that decision.
So that was a guy that still was going to be a key part of this defense. They had already traded Jerome Baker away, and I just feel like it comes down to run defense because of everything we've heard about Mike Macdonald, from what they liked about Tyrese Knight and maybe what wasn't happening, despite better run defense against the Rams, that was still the major issue. So much of this scheme feels like it's occupied by the linebackers making the correct read. When the D-line sucks up that space, they take on those blocks and they carve out those distinct lanes. If the linebackers weren't filling them, well, I think there's the adjustment that's going to be made.
One thing that stands out to me about this release that the Seahawks are going to do later today is that this offseason we spent a lot of it talking about, well, why hasn't Mike Macdonald brought in a lot of guys with Baltimore ties? Why hasn't there been a lot of guys brought in with ties to this coaching staff? Tyrel Dodson was one of those players that did have ties to a significant member of this coaching staff. Dodson spent 4 years on the Bills defense. Leslie Frazier, assistant head coach, spent time as Dodson's defensive coordinator in Buffalo through his first 3 seasons in the NFL, because Frazier's last year with the Bills was 2022, spent 2023 off and is back here in Seattle in 2024. I imagine this move does not happen without the blessing or without the approval of Leslie Frazier, a guy who has spent a lot of time with Dodson over the years. And to see a guy who I think is pretty tight with the coaching staff, Dodson having the green dot, having the ties to Leslie Frazier, seeing them essentially move on from one another, I mean, that's significant. That is a move that I did not see happening. I did not think that it was going to happen. I thought Dodson, if the Seahawks did choose to move on from Dodson, it probably would have been after the season. He just signed the 1-year deal. But to do it midway through the year, to do it entering into a huge divisional matchup against the 49ers, it's a surprise to me, the timing of it all.
Yeah, I wonder if you're going to see some different looks then defensively. If you are going to see some safeties play in the box a little more, like a Kobe Bryant come up there, or Devin Witherspoon, who we have seen in the nickel, come up and be a physical tackler, because on the surface, you're right, it's extremely surprising that you overhauled this linebacking core in the offseason. You brought in these two guys, and maybe it was a stopgap measure, but they also were two veterans. And out of those two, Jerome Baker had much less playing time, much less experience. Tyrel Dodson was the experienced one. That's why they made the move to move him off that natural position. So moving him back to Will is what happened when Ernest Jones came in. But the Seahawks said, we're moving him to Mike because he's got more experience than Jerome Baker. We trust him with this defense, and something just wasn't clicking or was not coming to fruition with how he was going to be tasked with calling this defense. And you know what? For a guy that puts so much on linebackers, there's probably less leeway if you're screwing up as a linebacker in Mike McDonald's defense.
Oh, man, he's got to be, every time he saw Baker or Dodson, misread something, or he probably was just so beside himself. Mike McDonald does a really good job of keeping an even keel face, but you can tell beneath the surface, there's a rage to him, kind of like Bob Stelton. Beneath the surface, there is a rage to Bob Stelton.